Our keynote today is Dr. James Loewen. He is Professor Emeritus of Sociology, formerly of UVM and Tougaloo University. Jim is dedicated to truth-telling in historical narrative and is an avid paddler, a passion that he and I both share. You can check out his newest book. It's a memoir, Up a Creek with a Paddle. It is details just his long life within paddling, but also has many vignettes of his experiences working in the field. And I just want to introduce him just really quickly with a quote from his email signature. It says here, "Telling the truth about the past helps cause justice in the present. Achieving justice in the present helps us tell the truth about the past." And without further ado, Dr. James Loewen.
Well, hi, everybody. I am delighted to be with you. I wish I were with you actually, but I'll do the best I can virtually. I want to say something about my title. Students, high school students, even middle school students, who knows, maybe even second graders, it seems to me are newly empowered. We see, for example, in sundown towns, and I'm going to do a workshop this afternoon on sundown towns. They are all white communities that are all white on purpose, and there's a bunch of them in Connecticut. But anyway, we see even in sundown towns, high school students leading BLM marches. Of course, that's Black Lives Matter marches. I'm going to say a word about that. We see these famous now high school students in Florida speaking out and in some ways leading the conversation about gun control and school shoot-ups. And I think that there's a new willingness then for students to become involved, to become citizens. And I think we and you as social studies teachers need to grab this initiative and run with it. I think it is no longer appropriate, of course I never thought it was, but it's no longer appropriate just to teach the textbook. We've got to get out there, and there needs to be an activist component to our teaching. That's the point of my title. Well, next slide. So I wish I were there in person. And so I put this up because it is there. I have spoken all over Connecticut. I've spoken to the east, to the west, to the north. There is kind of a north, and certainly along the coast. And I like it dearly. I like it dearly. Is that okay? And I would much rather be with you in person. For one thing, I'm going to try to tell jokes and stuff. And there's nothing worse than telling jokes to a computer screen, you know? So you're going to have to laugh really hard so that I can hear you clear down here in DC. All right. Well, that's all I'm going to say about that. Next slide, yeah. So I'm going to suggest that we need to do 4 things. And 2 of them I'm doing workshops about, so I'm not going to say much about them here in this keynote. After George Floyd, I actually talked with somebody in Mississippi yesterday who has no idea who George Floyd is, but I'm going to assume that you all, or was, I'm going to assume that you all have not been living with your head under a bushel basket, so you do know who he was. And after all the BLM protests that, of course, antedated George Floyd and have continued afterward, I think there's 4 areas that we've got to focus on. How we teach U.S. history and social studies. And I'm going to focus on that in this keynote. Local public history, which I did give a workshop on earlier. Sundown towns, which I will give a workshop on later. And finally, teacher expectations and student performance. So, next slide. First thing we need to help students think about, and students' parents sometimes, is BLM. And I have to say that BLM can off-put people, and we don't want to off-put anybody if we can help it. Of course, we know that a big answer back to it is, all lives matter. And who can argue with that? Of course, all lives matter. I think one way to help people think about BLM is to understand that there is an implied word at the end of it, BLM2. That is, Black Lives Matter too. And I don't think any even misbegotten white person can argue that. Black lives do surely matter too, all right? A second point that I think we need to make to, shall we say, recalcitrant people on this issue is that we need to focus on police behavior, not victim behavior, okay? Yes, some of the victims, perhaps even including Mr. Floyd, have been people of questionable character. Some of them have done bad things. That's not the, some of them have not. Some of them are exemplary citizens. Some of them are 12-year-olds with a toy gun. The point is not the victim behavior. The point is the police behavior. And we all have an interest in that. I want to give you a little riff, if you will, about why police forces need to be interracial, desegregated, and the same for prosecutors, just in order to be competent. Okay, even in a white part of the state of Connecticut, and for sure in any other part of the state of Connecticut. And this was an aha moment I had many, many years ago in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, Mississippi in 1967, I'm talking about, when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, was not a bastion of interracial progress. For that matter, it's not a bastion of interracial progress even now, but it sure wasn't then. I wrote a doctoral dissertation called, and it's still in print incidentally, The Mississippi Chinese Between Black and White. And yes, Mississippi has a comparatively large Chinese population. It even had segregated separate Chinese schools as well as black schools and white schools. Most people don't know that unless they've read my book. Well, they couldn't have read my book then. I was still writing it. But I was in Vicksburg, Mississippi, over on the Mississippi River. I was in a Chinese American's grocery store. And this grocery store was up a little hollow, kind of. Vicksburg is a hilly place. And it was in this little neighborhood that is an interracial neighborhood. There's black folks living up in that part and white folks living up in that. And the only social center is this grocery store. And so there'd be black folks and white folks hanging around, sitting on the Coke cases. The Chinese American proprietor didn't mind because he was selling the Cokes and selling sardines and crackers and other things. And once in a while, there'd be an argument that might grow into an altercation, and he would have to call the police. And he told me, the police always ask, are they white? Are they black? And if they were white, they would send a white officer, partly because white Mississippians in 1967 did not want to be arrested by or even confronted by a black officer. And if they were black, they would send a black officer. Just elementary. Elementary in Mississippi and Vicksburg in 1967. And yet we have all of these former sundown towns. Just to take one example, Ferguson, Missouri. I think you've heard of Ferguson. Ferguson was a sundown town. By the time of its racial disturbances, it was 66% black. But its police force was still was still DWB, driving while black, was still overwhelmingly white, exactly one black officer per shift, incompetent. Unless you actually believe that almost all of the criminals in Ferguson were white, in that case, yes, then you need an overwhelmingly white police force. But the city being 2/3 black, I don't think anybody's ever argued that whites commit most of the crime in a city where they're a minority. So that's just BS. Competence demands it. So that's something to think about too. And then the final point I want to make about this, just to get us on the same page about BLM, it will help us all. I speak as a white male, an old white male, we sometimes may need a social worker rather than an armed cop. Now, it's too bad that we have this rhetoric that says defund the police. That's not really what they mean, and it's certainly not what many African Americans in my neighborhood want. We want the police funded, but much of the time, maybe most of the time, when we call 911, we really need an intelligent social worker rather than an armed cop. And we also need, when we get pulled over, when I get pulled over for speeding or for whatever, some respect, you know? And for that matter, there are cases of white folks being killed by police for doing nothing but disrespecting the police during a confrontation. So we all need this kind of thing. So I hope you can help your students bring their parents on board so that we don't have a whole big issue in Connecticut about BLM. Well, next slide. So now we're back to the things I'm going to talk about, having hopefully gotten that out of the way. And I'm mainly going to talk about number 1 and number 4. So next slide. I want to explain, number 1 being about history, and I'm going to spend a lot of time about history today, how I, as a sociologist, got so interested in U.S. history. Now, the first point I have to make is the world does not come divided into history over here and sociology over here, maybe economics is over there, poli-sci. So, you know, the world is the world. The past and the present are tied together. My dissertation on Chinese people in Mississippi from about 1870 to when I wrote the work, was that history? Well, of course. Was that sociology? Well, of course. That's the first point I would make. But the second point I would make was I want to tell you an aha story that got me so interested in history as an important thing to teach and an important way to cause change. And that happened at Tougaloo College, this small black college in deepest Mississippi, where I spent the first 7 years of my teaching career. And it was during my first year. In fact, it was the first day of the second semester. I was teaching the courses I expected to be teaching in sociology, but I was also pressed into service to teach one section of the freshman social science seminar. Now, this was a course that was invented by the history department to introduce students to, you know, the drill, sociology, anthro, psych, econ, poli-sci, and it did this in the context of African-American history. Made sense, 99% of our students being African-American. Now, when you're in that context, that's the same chronology as, shall we say, regular American history. And so second semester begins not just after Christmas, but also just after the Civil War, with the period known as, and you all said Reconstruction, right? Yes, okay. So I had a new group of students that first day of the second semester. I didn't want to do all the talking that first day of class. So I asked them, what is Reconstruction? What images come to your mind about that? And 16 of 17 of them said, Reconstruction was, and this is what they said, it's up on the screen, it was the period right after the Civil War when blacks took over the government of the southern states, but they were too soon out of slavery, and so they screwed up and white folks had to take control again. Well, my little heart sank. There are at least 3, maybe 4 direct lies in that sentence, of course. If I were with you in person, I'd generate them from you really fast. Obviously, blacks never took over the government of the southern states. All of the southern states had white governors throughout the period. All but one had white legislative majorities as well. Second of all, the Reconstruction governments did not screw up. Now, without exception, across the South, they passed the best state constitutions that the southern states have ever had, including better than the ones that they labor under today. They came up with various interesting, and they invented the public school system. Mississippi had not had really a system for white folks. They had just a few scattered public schools for white folks, and they had no school whatsoever for black folks. In fact, it was a felony to teach even free blacks to read or write during slavery time. And so the white folks didn't take control at the end of Reconstruction. A certain group did, white racist Democrats. We have to remember that the Democratic and Republican Party in 1964 more or less switched places on who was going to be the party of white supremacy. But in the 19th century, the Democrats were the party of white supremacy. Said so. They called themselves the white man's party. They took control again using KKK. Indeed, it was the original KKK. And then we have the concept too soon out of slavery. Now there's a concept as if slavery was somehow a educational enterprise that black folks were benefiting from when they weren't even allowed to read and write. So I call this an aha experience for me because 16 of my 17 students believed this. By the way, the 17th, he was very, very shy because he was in such a tiny minority. He said, "Oh, I didn't think it was so bad. Didn't they start the schools and stuff?" And I said, "Where did you go to school?" I wanted to go hug his teacher wherever she was or he was. And almost all of our students are from Mississippi, but he said, "Gary, Indiana." Oh, well. All right. So how could that happen? Well, I went to nearby schools to see how this could happen. And Tougaloo was a very good college. I went to nearby black schools because this was just before massive desegregation in the Deep South, literally months before. I watched as black teachers taught all black classes, white BS history. By the way, I'm using BS in its technical sense. It means bad sociology. Okay. I didn't hear you laugh. You got to laugh louder. Okay. Because they were just teaching what was in the book, in the textbook, especially in the course Mississippi history, required in 5th grade and then required again in 9th grade. And the book was absolutely white supremacist. It taught exactly what my students had learned. Well, after 7 years, well, I actually kind of solved that problem because I finally put together I got a grant and I put together a team of teachers and students at Tougaloo and at Millsaps College, the nearby white school. And we wrote a new history textbook for that course. And then the state of Mississippi rejected it and we sued them and we won. It's a very important case called Loewen et al. Versus Turnipseed et al. Yes, there are people in Mississippi named Turnipseed. So that had some impact and still continues to have some impact. Matter of fact, the book is now going to be revised and come out 40 years later as a 2nd edition. But then I moved to the University of Vermont. I claim that I have taught at the blackest and the whitest schools in America. UVM did, of course, have black students. And in fact, one semester I actually had her in class. But I continued to teach first-year students in huge courses called Intro Soc. I like teaching first year. They give you a wonderful window on the world of high school, if you think about it. But my UVM students, only 40% of whom are from Vermont, the rest are from places like Connecticut and Massachusetts and all the way down to DC, New Jersey, even Chicago suburbs. My students knew the damnedest things about the past that never happened. And they didn't know some of the most important things that did happen. And so that set me on my route to writing Lies My Teacher Told Me. Well, the rest is history in a way. Lies My Teacher Told Me turns out to have become the best-selling book by a living sociologist. There are sociologists have done better, but they are dead. You can't have them keynote. It's pushing 2 million now. It's selling better than ever. And some of you in Connecticut have already been telling me how you use it for your AP US history class or for other courses. I hope you do. And if you don't, if you've never read it, I think you should, even out of self-protection. This is my very favorite email. I got it shortly after the book came out in paperback. It was from a high school student somewhere in AOL. Remember AOL? I think in California. And he said, "Dear Mr. Loewen, I really like your book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. I've been using it to heckle my teacher from the back of the room." I thought that was great. And he went on to say, "And my friends all like the book too. And if I could get a group price on it from the publisher, I could sell it in the corridors of my high school." So I sent his email off to the publisher. A day or so later, I got back a group price, sent it off to him, heard back from him the next day. "Dear Mr. Loewen, thank you very much for the group price on Lies My Teacher Told Me. However, I have to put my plans on selling it in high school on hold because tomorrow I'm getting expelled for failing to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. So I lost my best salesman. That is, of course, an illegal expulsion, but it's only illegal if you have a lawyer. I mean, you know. Next slide. I suspect a lot of you have read Lies My Teacher Told Me. I don't know if you've read this book, and I do hope you have, and if not, I do hope you will now. Because this book is specifically written for you. And by you, I mean middle school, maybe even K through 12, social studies and history teachers, and perhaps especially the National Council for the Social Studies and the state and regional councils. You folks are just the best, and I hope you like this book, and I hope you get at least 1 or 2 or 3 useful, specific ideas that you can do out of it. And I also want to call your attention to the hilarious picture on the front. I won't do more than just say that right now, except to say that if any of you can adopt the book, like if you teach a social studies methods course at college, then you get a poster-sized copy of this picture, and you can stick it up in your room, and people will like it. It is Washington crossing the Delaware, but with a few new twists. All right, so I'm enough flogging of my book. That is the only book I want to flog to you folks. All right. The key thing, trick, technique, tactic that I want to teach you, and many of you already do it, I hope, is when you are teaching U.S. history or social studies, I'm not going to make a big differentiation between the two. When you are teaching that subject, teach the subject, don't teach the textbook, okay? Now, unfortunately, studies show that the subject in high school, most dominated by the textbook, in actually time and motion studies, is U.S. history. Now, this blew my mind. I mean, I would have thunk maybe plane geometry. I mean, how can you ask your parents about plane geometry? Don't even try it. How can you ask community resources about plane geometry? How can you use the library? It seems to me you are mostly using the textbook. But no, studies show that the textbook dominates U.S. history much more. And when you think about it anew, it does make sense because the textbooks are so big, and there seems to be some kind of compulsion to cover them. The first edition of Lies My Teacher Told Me came out way back in 1994, 95. The average textbook then was 888 pages. The current edition, the average textbook now is 1,152. They actually grew. Now, this makes no sense whatsoever. After all, back in 1994, when the book first came out, if you're teaching in, let's say, a little bitty town out from Washington, Connecticut, you may have no school library at all, or maybe a school community combined library that's the size of one room. I've been in towns that have libraries like that. So in 1994, you didn't have a whole lot of resources for teaching American history. Maybe you needed an 888-page textbook. I don't think so, but maybe. But now, 2020, or even any time in the last 20 years, you've got the web. There's no part of Connecticut that ain't wired for the web and doesn't have electricity. So you have access to hundreds of thousands of historic photographs at the Library of Congress. You've got access to amazing websites about the women's movement, either one, or maybe there have been 3. You've got access to, Civil War sites. You've got access to all kinds of stuff. What we really need is a 250-page paperback that we adopt, that students then own. They get given to them, and they can write in it, and it's their book. And maybe, who knows, maybe they'll buy another nonfiction book before they die. So don't teach the textbook. Don't cover the past. We want to uncover it. And I want to suggest that if you're teaching U.S. history, the first thing you want to do, and do it tonight, is come up with 30 to 50 topics that you think are important, that you think any 18-year-old needs to have heard about. And so you don't want your students to not have heard about. Now, this list cannot be totally arbitrary. If you leave out the making and use of the Constitution, that's not a competent list. If you leave out the impact, the Civil War and its impact, well, you got a bad list. But there's a lot of things in there that are optional, that you can teach, but you don't have to teach, okay? So I would suggest, and I'm going to spend a little time on this today, that the very first unit needs to be, how did folks get to the Western Hemisphere? How did they get to the Americas? Now, I will admit, that doesn't have to be in your list of 30 to 50. I suggest it should be, though. And one reason I suggest it should be is because we don't know. We don't know for sure. Now, one way I teach this, and if I were there in person, I would ask you, when and also how did the first people get here? And I'd say, write down a number. In fact, do that. Do it at home or wherever you are. Write down a number. When do you think people first got to the Americas? And if you have space, just write down a couple of words as to how did they get here, okay? All right, next slide. Now, a bunch of you, I suspect, wrote something like that. 15,000 BP. BP means, of course, before the present. You also could have written BC, 13,000 BC, before Christ, or BCE, before the Common Era, whatever you prefer. And that is what most of the textbooks teach. Unfortunately, all but one of the now 18 textbooks that I've read intensively on this subject, all but one of them teach an answer, just one answer. But there isn't just one answer. This used to be the most common answer given in archaeology. But archaeology is alive with controversy. Yes, it studies dead people, but it's got all kinds of controversies. This was the Beringia Hypothesis. And it sounds very impressive because we got a new word, Beringia. That's, of course, the land straits. You know the idea. During the last ice age, there's a bunch of ice piling up over Greenland, piling up over Antarctica, just opposite of what's happening now. And so the ocean level was going down, just the opposite of what's happening now. And it's only 52 miles across the Bering Strait right now, so it doesn't have to go down very far before you can walk across. Indeed, there's two little islands halfway across, and you can go there anyway and take a little rest. So that's what people did. They walked across. Now, there's some problems with this. The first problem is there's no actual evidence. That is, the archaeological evidence doesn't get earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier as we go up through Canada there and then up through the Yukon and then through Alaska. It doesn't happen. There was this little ice-free corridor briefly around 15,000 BP, but there's no particular blob of human remains or archaeological tools in that corridor. This is just a hypothesis. And I submit to you, the hypothesis is popular partly because we, and by we I mean we modern people, I particularly do mean we modern white people, but other people can participate in this misthinking too. We think of earlier people, especially Native American earlier people, but any earlier people maybe, as primitive. So they must have walked. Well, it turns out that 600,000 years ago, before humans were even human, we're talking a different, Homo erectus rather than Homo whatever we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be Homo sapiens. That means wise, and I think the actions of our last few years have disproven that. But anyway, Homo erectus reached some islands in eastern Indonesia that you can never walk to. So we know they had boats. We have no evidence of boats. There's no evidence of boats in Australia, but we know people got to Australia, and you can never walk from Asia to Australia. This is what's called the Wallace Line. It's too deep in one place. Why don't we have evidence of boats? Well, because anything more than 10,000 years ago, we only pretty much have evidence of stone tools. Wood doesn't last that long. And no people were ever so primitive that they had stone boats. All right? So why couldn't it have been by boat? I've actually been in some of this area up there in Alaska and also on the coast. And I can tell you, it would be a lot easier to paddle along the coast than it would be to trek through these forests, especially when much of them might have been glaciated. So there's no actual evidence. The only piece of evidence for this hypothesis, and it is important, is that the vast majority of American Indians, or Native Americans, the biggest group of them by far, has genetic similarities to people in northeastern Siberia, and also has some cultural similarities. So it's likely they came from there. But there's some inferential evidence that it was probably by boat. But if you actually read what the textbooks say, they make these people so primitive that, you know, they couldn't possibly have done it by boat. Well, next slide. So maybe they came by boat, maybe not. Poke it again and we'll get something else there. There we go. It may have been 25,000 to 50,000 years ago. And you'll see why I say that in a few minutes. There's some fascinating new evidence coming out of Brazil and other places. Poke it again. May have been by boat again. It may have been to South America. And it may even have been across the other direction. May have been two ways at once. May have been across the polar ice cap from Norway that way. One more poke. I want you to be aware that there's pretty good evidence now that a huge meteor or comet probably exploded over Canada about 13,000 years BP before the present. And this explosion was so catastrophic that it would have killed any people who were not in a cave or who were not in a lake, because it lit up the sky and it literally heated everything up. And then it was followed by probably by a kind of winter caused by the amazing amount of carbon and dust in the air. So this is another one of these new hypotheses that's coming around. So it may have been that a whole bunch of people came here 25 to 50,000 years ago, but then they went through a kind of Coke bottle waste. They went through millions of people became 2,000 people or whatever. This is incidentally probably what killed the megafauna, probably what killed the mammoths and the mastodons and the giant other giant animals that died in the Western Hemisphere. So my point is, let your students free in this first unit. Those who say 13,000 years, now we do have to deal with some religious assertions about this, and I talk about them in the book. I chose not to bring this up here. I do bring it up when I'm teaching this idea in, say, Utah. But we have to deal with religious freedom, but we also have to deal with compartmentalization, with the fact that we're not teaching religion here. We're teaching the right answer, if you will, for the history class, for a social studies class, and you just have to, there's ways to make that. See my book about this, my book being Teaching What Really Happened. All right, so you get some students arguing for the 50,000 year ago thing, some students arguing for the 12,000 years ago, whatever, and you help them each develop their argument, but also be open to other arguments. And this teaches them that, we have to think. Sometimes history is not just learning the right answer. And that's one reason why, even though you could teach a perfectly competent U.S. history course without even dealing with this issue, I would choose not to, because I think it's important to get across the idea that I just described, that thinking is good. My apologies. Oh, good, it got answered. Next slide. All right, now they're here. It used to be, during the nadir of race relations, which we'll talk about, during the period 1890 to 1940, that we conceptualized Native people as primitive. We were advanced, they're primitive, so naturally they fell behind. And I have a whole bunch of pictures about this at my website that you can make use of. You know these pictures. Westward, the the Empress makes her way, or something, the Spirit of Progress makes her way, and you see this beautiful Greek type nude going west, almost nude, with all kinds of railroad trains and stuff behind, and the native people kind of slinking off on this, manifest destiny. All right. That is bad sociology, or BS. That's not what happened. And indeed, we have a nicer storyline now. Now the textbooks say, well, Native Americans did have diverse cultures, and they teach about a couple of them, and interesting cultures, but they could not or would not acculturate. So again, naturally, now when a sociologist says naturally, he or she always says it with quotation marks, because it's not naturally. It's a matter of, it's so deep in our culture that we just think it always, of course it happened, but it's not naturally. So this too is BS. And let me show you the next slide and you'll see why. So this is the house of a person named Chief Joseph Vann. He was a Cherokee Indian in northern Georgia. I've been to this house. I might have taken that picture. It is now a Georgia State Park. Chief Vann was not a chief. As a matter of fact, he was kind of a drunk, but he was a rich Native American. This is a Gone with the Wind house, right? This is a plantation home with the pillars in front and everything. And indeed, Chief Joseph Vann did own a plantation. He owned a bunch of black slaves. He acculturated pretty well. I mean, he became a racist just like white folks, and owned slaves just like white folks. He was probably a little bit nicer. Native people actually kind of, never mind, I won't go into that right now. But he clearly acculturated. What did it do for him? Absolutely nothing. In fact, it made him a target. The sheriff took his house several years before the vast majority of Cherokee people were forced illegally to leave and to go to Oklahoma. So all it did was make him a target. And when I teach this, I say, okay, now let's imagine that people whose last names start with L, a group I particularly like, just for the record, people whose last names start with L have no legal rights. They can't testify in court against people whose last names start with anything else. Now, I own a really nice car right now. At least I like it. It's not that expensive, but it's a Volvo convertible, hardtop convertible. How long would I own my car? Anybody whose last name started with K or M or anything else could take it, right? And I couldn't do anything about it because I couldn't testify against him or her. So I would have nothing soon enough. Well, that's the situation Native people were in. It wasn't a failure to acculturate. We, non-natives, particularly white folks, did not allow them to acculturate. All right, so and we have to teach it that way. We cannot just teach it that it's their fault that they didn't acculturate. It's because that's not true. This is this, whoops, go back. This is the stupidest single story that we tell about Native people. And unfortunately, it's very widespread. You'll see how widespread it is in a minute. This is, of course, well, the way I teach this is, and I've done it with fifth graders in Connecticut, I ask them, what is the most important purchase ever made in the history of this country for exactly $24? And in fact, I go on, $24 worth of beads. We're talking about the purchase of, and I pause, and you all yell, Manhattan, right? And people do usually say Manhattan, especially they do in New England. They even do in Chicago. I once tried to teach this in Laredo, Texas, and it failed completely because they don't learn this in Laredo. And I commended them for their ignorance. I really did, genuinely. They had never been commended for ignorance before, but I said, you people start at zero learning about this, which is way ahead of everybody else because we all start at minus 15 because we know this total BS. Well, so this is a picture. This is a sculpture of this transaction. And this sculpture is located at the exact point where it never took place. That is in South Ferry, the park at the south end of Manhattan. Many of you have seen this or have walked right past it. It's kind of right out in front of the National Museum of the American Indian museum there. It's also right near where you take the Staten Island Ferry and right near where you get the little boat that takes you to the Statue of Liberty and to Ellis Island. And there you see on the right, the Dutchman, on the left, the Native American, and in the middle, the $24 worth of beads. Now, what's wrong with this story? And here I pause. And if I were there in person, I'd pause and we'd see what happened. And often when I pause, nobody says anything. And then somebody says, that's a Plains Indian. And they're right. And that's the first thing that's wrong with this picture. That's a Native American headdress from, say, South Dakota. Now, you can put something like that on in South Dakota and ride around on a horse, no problem. But if you try to wear it in Manhattan, it's going to hit a tree branch. You know, we're walking through a forest here. So that's complete BS. In fact, ironically, it's not only off by 1,500 miles or so, it's also off by 150 years or so, because the Plains Indian culture had not even been invented in 1630 or something, when this transaction never took place. So, but you had to know something to get that wrong. There's something even more obviously wrong about this picture. And I hope you're clicking. I can't tell. And that is, let's just put it this way. I have been in New York, standing outside, in fact, in February once, when it was minus 20. I was okay because I had my amazing EMS parka on. But I submit to you, if this transaction that never took place in the winter, then that is one cold Native American. I have also been in New York in early August, when, if this transaction took place in early August, that Dutchman is about to die of heat stroke. So I submit to you, no two people have ever been dressed like that on the same day, on the same spot. And we see that, and usually nobody brings it up, or there's a long pause before somebody finally brings it up. It's impossible. Why did we do this in stone? And why did we not notice it? Well, I submit the reason is because we're used to it. And what we're really seeing there is primitive on the left and civilized on the right. And so we're used to it. And it's BS. Now, let me deconstruct this just a little bit more. I asked my father before he died if he ever learned this. He went to school in southern Minnesota. And yes, he said he did. He thought he learned it in 3rd grade, which would put it in 1911. So he learned $24 in 1911. I learned 24. Kids this fall are learning $24. This is the only $24 in the history of the world never to undergo inflation. Makes no sense. I did a correlation backward, and I have learned that $24 back then is about $2,400 now. Furthermore, we now know pretty surely, and you can see what I write about this in Lies Across America, that beads were not even involved. What the Native people wanted, and what they couldn't make themselves, was guns, steel knives, steel axes, brightly colored woven woolen blankets, Hudson Bay blankets, some people call them, and metal kettles, which they used for kettles, but which they also made all kinds of other stuff out of. For about $2,400 worth of that stuff, the Dutch bought the rights to Manhattan from the Canarsies. Now you can go, especially if you're in Connecticut, you can go to New York now and you can get on the subway and you can go to Canarsie. And when you get off, you are in Brooklyn. Matter of fact, you're in East Brooklyn at the end of the line. That's where the Canarsies lived. Why wouldn't they sell Manhattan? Wasn't theirs. Are you getting the picture here? There's something wrong with this story. Next picture. Another thing that just another way to deal with it is to ask students to put themselves in the shoes of the Native person. If you were that guy, we won't go back to him, but if you were that nearly nude guy holding the beads, would you sell your share of this? This being, it's kind of a schematic drawing, but it's by John White, the British explorer, if you will. Would you sell your share of this, of your village, of your fields? You see the fields off to the right, of your gardens. Would you sell your share of that for your share of that little batch of beads? And do what? Move off to New Jersey? Move off to Westchester County? There are already Native people living there. You'd have to fight them for it, or at least argue with them for it. You wouldn't. Well, then maybe just maybe these people didn't either. Maybe they too are rational human beings. Next slide. Here's how widespread it is. This is an ad for shoes in North Carolina, okay? You think buying Manhattan for $24. I got shoes. And you can see that that is a genuine Native American princess there selling you those shoes. Well, next slide. And here's the interesting thing about this. In a way, we all know better. I mean, you maybe didn't know the story about the Wakaiskeks, and I haven't even finished this story. I didn't even mention the Wakaiskeks. The Wakaiskeks are the folks who lived on Manhattan. I did mention the Canarsies. Well, let's talk about the Wakaiskeks here. You did know about the most famous street in America. It's especially been famous the last 5 years with the 1% and all. And that street is, of course, Wall Street. And there's a picture of it. It's at the top of that picture there. It's named for the wall that the Dutch built on the north side of that street. And what was that wall? That wall was to keep out the Wakaiskeks, because the Wakaiskeks didn't like the Dutch presence down at the bottom of the island, didn't like it a bit, and so they raided them every so often. Well, that's why they built the wall. Finally, the Dutch got really pissed off, and they wiped out the Wakaiskeks, probably with help from the Canarsies, right? Now, that makes some sense. I mean, those native people seem to be acting in some self-interest, you know? And plus, we already knew about Wall Street. But nevertheless, we tell this idiotic story. Let's see what the next slide says. We'll leave it there, but I want to say a couple more things about it. Since the $24 story makes no sense at all, a question might come up: how come it doesn't get challenged? Now, I remember who taught it to me. It was actually my second grade teacher, Miss Elliott. Okay, might have been Ms. Elliott, I'm not sure. I didn't question it because I'm in second grade. I understand that. But why didn't she question it? Well, and that gets into what's the payoff from this story. And I submit there is a payoff that causes us non-Indians, maybe, certainly us white folks, but certainly maybe all non-natives, to not question it too much. And that is, it makes us look good. I mean, we didn't take the land from the natives. We bought it from them fair and square. And by God, it didn't cost much either, $24 worth of beef, because those Indians, they weren't too bright. Or sometimes the textbooks say, well, they just didn't understand the same concept about buying and selling land. I mean, they kind of thought land was like air, right? I mean, this is air. If I were in the room with you, I'd say this is our air. Now, that's my air. I'm using it. It's in me. I'm using that. But as soon as I do that, it's our air again. And that's how Native people thought about land. Total BS. That is not how they thought about land. They did not think you should buy and sell it individually, but they certainly thought a village could buy land, could sell land, could give land away, could sell land, but retain certain rights on it, like the right of trespass, the right of hunting and gathering, etc. There's no doubt about that. Sometimes the early white settlers didn't agree to, didn't follow through on what they had agreed to do in terms of that. But anyway, that's just more BS. And it isn't, of course, just Manhattan. Every single textbook that I examined, and I examined 18, I'm the only American ever to have read 18 high school American history textbooks. It was a near-death experience. So boring. Every single one of them has a map like this. This is a map, of course, of the biggest purchase. Only this purchase is from France, the purchase of Louisiana Territory. Well, I won't go way into it. You may remember that we sent a couple of ambassadors to Napoleon's court, actually, while he was having a little trouble losing a war against Haiti. And he realized if he can't even defeat Haiti, he's never going to be able to hold on to Louisiana for really long. So why not sell it now? And so he sold it, but he didn't sell it. He knew what he was selling. In fact, right after his ambassadors sold it, they said to our ambassadors, well, now you will have to find out what we sold you because we don't have a clue. What they sold them was Louisiana, which is down there at the bottom, the state of Louisiana now, New Orleans and so on, and the European rights, listen to this, the European rights to all the land drained by the rivers that flow into it. And so that's why there's that little notch there up in North Dakota. Those rivers flow northward into Canada. But they know they didn't really own it. They're just selling the European rights. Textbooks don't say this. As a matter of fact, we spent $15 million for those European rights, but we spent more than $30 million buying it from various Native American groups over the next half century. And we also fought more than 30 different armed engagements, taking it from Native American groups over the next half century. But look at this map. Ain't no natives on it, right? The closest we have is a place called Fort Mandan. There was no Fort Mandan. That's where the Mandan Indians lived. All of these maps include the Lewis and Clark expedition. They should. The one followed the other. And furthermore, it's the same geography, so why not save the space? But the first year, they spent the winter with the Mandan Indians. The Mandans said, look, we'll kill you a couple of buffalo because you better build some houses. They built log cabins, not like the Indians did. But the Mandans were very sophisticated people. They had already had contact with British people, with Lakota people. They were trading people. They had a whole village, 2,000 people. There's no Fort Mandan, but we call it Fort Mandan. Interesting. The next year, we didn't spend it with the Clatsop Indians, but just down, they weren't as nice, but they were all right. But we wanted to talk with them to learn about what are the Russians doing and to learn about how do you make a living in the state of, what is now the state of Washington and Oregon and so on. And so we located near them, and we did kind of palisade that a little bit, but it's not Fort Clatsop, it's near the Clatsop Indians. And they disappear. And all the natives in between disappear with the exception of Sacagawea, but never mind about her right now. All right. So this is bad history. It's white folks against the wilderness with Sacagawea and with York, the one black person. Bad history. Okay. And the Lewis and Clark expedition wasn't that bad. You know, we could tell it straight and we don't have to hang our head, but all right. So we get all kinds of things wrong and racist about Native people. Next slide. It's not just natives, and I want to give this example because, for one thing, because it made such a difference to me. I only learned about this, I think, when I was 71, and I'm now 78. So that would have been 7 years ago. And I tried to figure out how could I live 71 years on the planet and never have known anything about this. This guy, you know who this is? This, I don't see why you would, but this is, in fact, Vasco da Gama on a good day. I mean, he's dressed like a king. Well, he did become pretty darn wealthy. Whether he looked like this, I'm not sure. I don't know if this is painted 100 years after the fact or if it's really from life. I don't know. Who was Vasco da Gama? When I have asked other groups of NCSS people, I always get, well, he was an explorer, right? And yes, he was an explorer. He's one of that pantheon of explorers that we're kind of very impressed with. Uh-oh, I'm trying to look at my time. I'm almost out of time, am I not? Shoot. All right, I'm going to speed through this, and I'm going to actually skip my whole presentation about teacher expectations. I will just make this talk about things we get wrong about American history. I'm going to read to you a paragraph about Vasco da Gama. He's the guy who discovered India. Well, we don't say that. It's interesting why we don't say that. But he's the explorer who sailed around the bottom of Africa and got to India. Not the first time it was ever done. It was done 1,000 years earlier, but the first time the Europeans did it. All right. And here's what he did on his second visit. And this is what's so key. You always have to ask, what did the explorers do when they came back? He comes to this city in southern India, Calicut, and he brings an armada and he shells it. And these armadas are far more power. They're like Attila the Hun on the naval, far more power than any little one city in India can resist. And I'm going to read you from an almost eyewitness as to what happened. He shells them because he demands that they stop trading with the Moors, stop trading with the Arabs, and start trading with them because they got the true religion, Christianity, and those Moors are a bunch of infidels that worship Muslims, worship Islam and the wrong people. And they don't want to do this. They're intermarried with them. They think they're fine. And so he shells them, and then he withdraws to let them think about it. And while he's withdrawing, unbeknownst to everybody, a batch of Arab ships comes in from the west. They don't know that he's off there, and they're going to trade with the city as they always do. And so the Gama goes over to them, and I'm going to read it. The Portuguese caravels went to them, and the Moors could not fly as they were laden. Okay, and the caravels brought them to the Gama. He then ordered the boats to go and plunder the small vessels, which were 16, and the 2 ships, in which they found rice and many jars of butter and many bales of stuff. Then the Gama commanded them to cut off the hands and the ears and the noses of all the crews. Now listen to this. And put all of that onto one of the small vessels. When all the Indians had thus been done to, he ordered their feet to be tied together, as they had no hands with which to untie them. And in order that they could not untie them with their teeth, he ordered his crew to strike upon their teeth with staves, and they knocked them down their throats. Sometimes this is so sad I can't even read it all. And they were then put on board, heaped up on top of each other, mixed up with the blood which streamed from them, and he ordered mats and dry leaves to be spread over them, and the sails to be set for the shore, and the vessel set on fire, and there were more than 800 Moors thus done to. And the small vessel with all the hands and ears was also set on shore under sail without being fired. These vessels went at once on shore, where many